On this edition of Independent Sources, how is faith affecting Jewish support for the Tea Party?
Indigenous communities take bolder steps to remake their image in the mainstream.
And have images of Mexico's border violence become sexually provocative?
Welcome to Independent Sources. I'm Vianora Vinca.
And I'm Garry Pierre-Pierre. The Tea Party movement has been gaining substantial steam in the run-up to the November midterm elections. So much so that pundits believe that some Tea Party candidates may actually stand a chance of winning enough seats to push their agenda in the House and Senate.
However, the party's ascension has raised a few eyebrows in the Jewish community. There's particular concern over some Tea Party support of an end to foreign aid to Israel. More so, some Jewish voters find the party's Christian crusading a bit much.
I sat down with Nathan Guttman of The Forward and Adam Dickter of the Jewish Press to talk about the Jewish community's response to the Tea Party's brand of politics. Adam, what is it about the Tea Party movement that is so worrisome to Jews and to Jewish Americans in general?
Well, I think there are two different factions of the Tea Party. One is the faction which is probably much larger, which is a faction that is driven by concern about the economy, about the soaring debt. And the other faction is the faction that wants to cut more government and cut down. And then there's the faction that we're seeing much more of, which is the faction that is much more conservative and almost militant on some social issues, much more right-wing agenda. I think that's the element that is scary to some people. That's the element that is more likely to get media attention, showing up at events, protests with the signs. It's a movement that was galvanized during the healthcare debate last year, galvanized by concerns about immigration, about gay marriage. And that's an element that I think you're seeing more of, but there's really no way to judge how strong each element is. I think they're united under one banner of the Tea Party, but there's almost like a fight for control for the rudder of this movement.
And Nathan, as far as relations with Israel, I mean, we are taking this Tea Party movement seriously. How do Jews react to their views on Israel, the Tea Party's views on Israel?
Well, in general, I don't think the Tea Party has a view on Israel. This is not their main issue. And as we heard before, their galvanizing issue is actually economic, financial. They're worried about other things. But into this big tent of the Tea Party movement, all kind of different factors have entered. On the one hand, we can see what we could call the Sarah Palin factor, which is faction which is very supportive of the Israeli Likud government. On the other hand, there are libertarians such as Rand Paul who would like to see no U.S. involvement overseas, no foreign aid to anyone, including Israel. So there's a whole range of ideas and opinions that you can find there, and that, in a certain sense, is what's so concerning for Jewish pro-Israeli activists.
Now, when we talk about activists, there are some Jewish activists who are worried about the Tea Party. For instance, the Joyce Keller, she's the executive director of the Ohio Jewish community. And she said the strategy here is to make friends and then later on in January have more nuanced conversation with Tea Party candidates or ultimately officials, elected officials, vis-a-vis Israel. Is that a strategy that's countrywide, or is that really for Ohio?
It's always good to have a dialogue with an emerging movement. As I said, this is a movement that's really still taking shape. And I agree with Nathan that to the extent that there is an agenda on Israel, not Israel specifically, it's an anti-foreign policy in general, more of an isolationist view. I think they're against foreign aid of any kind. And of course, we know a tremendous amount of foreign aid goes to Israel. So I do think that there's a faction of this Tea Party movement that is moderate that can be spoken to about this, and is not going to take that kind of Pat Buchanan isolationist view. To that extent, a dialogue early on in the movement is probably a wise idea. I think the Anti-Defamation League as well has been very concerned, as I mentioned, about the people who show up at those rallies, very extremist signs, and ties to extremist organizations that operate on the internet. And there have been some links with that. And I think there are elements within the Tea Party movement have moved to reject that because they realize that it is a bad thing for them to be associated with at this nascent point in the movement.
And Nathan, and doing some research on this topic, I didn't really see any sort of incendiary comments from Tea Party candidates regarding Israel. Why is there so much uncertainty among Jewish Americans about the Tea Party?
I think, first of all, Jewish Americans like to be in good relations with all parties in the whole spectrum of the political map. And all of a sudden, there is this new party that emerges, this new movement. Jewish Americans don't know much about it, don't have many ties with activists in the Tea Party movement. So first and foremost, there's a concern because this is the great unknown. And also, just because, as we mentioned, there are these elements of isolationists that are not a significant part of the Tea Party movement, but are still active in it. That is something that causes some kind of unease among activists.
Are there signals, Adam, that Tea Party candidates and potential elected officials would, let's say, for instance, cut the aid that the U.S. gives to Israel?
Well, certainly there are some, but two things to point out, and one is that Jews, as you know, are overwhelmingly Democrat voters in this country, unless in almost every part of the country, unless there's a tremendously good reason. Like here in New York, there have been some candidates like Rudy Giuliani, George Pataki, Al D'Amato, who've been Republicans, who are mostly moderate on social issues, have gotten a higher than usual amount of Jewish support, but it's overwhelmingly a Democratic movement. The second thing is that voters, Jewish voters, for whom Israel is a top concern, meaning the top concern, are a minority. I think for the most part, and that's why there's that allegiance to the Democratic Party, because I think for the most part what Jews are concerned about is fairness for everybody, openness, opportunity for everybody, and social issues, overwhelmingly pro-choice, pro-gay rights, anti-gun control, and this economy is certainly concerns about employment and the economy. I think are probably the most important issues for the majority. They're certainly not going to support someone who they feel is anti-Israel. But I think for the most part, the number of people for whom that's a deciding factor is a minority.
It takes me to my next question. Can any serious political party in this country be taken seriously by having a hardline stance against Israel? What do you think, Nathan?
Well, I guess it depends how you define a hardline stance. I think definitely we're seeing now a Democratic administration that is taking a critical stance regarding certain aspects of the Israeli government, and that is encountering some pushback from Congress, but definitely this kind of dialogue can happen. Is there a chance of having a party that will call for cutting off all foreign aid to Israel, or severing the strategic alliance between the United States and Israel? I don't think that has any kind of traction with the American public, and polls show that that's not where Americans are right now. So I don't think a political party with this kind of an ideology would be possible.
Adam, your take on the same question?
No, I agree. I think that candidates who have been extremely anti-Israel, either in local elections or in national elections, have not done well because, as Nathan said, polls have shown that regardless of how you feel about Israel in terms of its policies, I think a lot of people realize that there's a strategic alliance that's important for us to have that foothold, to have a stable democratic ally in the Middle East. And while a lot of people might disagree on the Palestinian issue, I think that for the most part, they believe that a strong and viable Israel is in the interest of our country, and the money that we're spending there, a lot of which is spent in the United States in terms of defense contracting, and the money that we spend supporting Israel is in America's interest. So I don't think you get a lot of traction, and there is, of course, a very active lobby. And it's not just Jews, it's supported very heavily by Christian conservatives who also feel very strongly about the security of Israel. So I think it would be the detriment for the most part of any candidate who wants to make that a primary part of their policy.
Nathan, I know we've been describing the Tea Party movement as being isolationist. Now, how involved are they on foreign policy in Washington? Who speaks for them?
Not many, because it's not really an issue that the Tea Party is behind or united behind. As I mentioned before, there are voices like that of Rand Paul in Kentucky or his father, Congressman Ron Paul, that are the voices of this isolationist policy. But on the other hand, you have voices like Sarah Palin that are on the other end of this spectrum. So I don't think there is any one voice, or definitely not one politically significant voice in Washington that advocates this policy of isolationism.
Very difficult world indeed.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we have to leave this conversation there. Adam Dickter, Nathan Guttman, thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
Pleasure to be here.
Still to come on Independent Sources, Indigenous media stamp their own identity.
But before that, Abi Ishola has some other news.
Thanks, Gary. Here's a look at some headlines from the ethnic media. Carib News reports that community leaders and Black clergy are encouraging residents to speak up as crime continues to remain an issue in areas throughout central Brooklyn. Bishop Cecil Riley, head of the Freedom Hall Church of God, says he finds that the mothers and grandmothers of many young criminals are afraid to speak out against their children. His goal is to offer guidance to empower them. From the Forward, Jewish lawmakers want to amend Title VI, or the Civil Rights Act, to include protection for Jewish students on college campuses. Senators Arlen Specter of Pennsylvania and Brad Sherman of California proposed the bill after Jewish students at different colleges claim to be harassed by pro-Palestinian students. Title VI currently only prohibits discrimination based on race, color, and nationality, but not religion. A New Jersey-based Filipina who is a quadruple amputee recently endured a successful 12-hour hand transplant. 33-year-old Sheila May Advento is now the 5th patient at the University of Pittsburgh Medical Center to receive the operation. Advento lost both her hands and legs in 2008 due to a serious blood infection. That from the Filipino Reporter. From the Amsterdam News, a nonprofit organization that promotes Africa wants the term Sub-Saharan Africa to be put to rest. Members of the Celebrate Africa Foundation say the term is used as a euphemism to differentiate between Arab Africans and Black Africans. The organization is looking to gather 2 million signatures to submit to world leaders, international organizations, and eventually the United Nations. And finally, the Italian Tribune reports that Google is now documenting the street views of Italy. Google received the go-ahead from the Italian government to collect photographs of Italian art cities that will be available online. The photographs will offer a 360-degree view of many Italian landmarks like the Roman Colosseum and the Baths of Caracalla as part of Google's Street View project. Those were just a few headlines from the ethnic media. Back to Gary and Vianora in the studio.
Thanks, Abby. When some people think of Native Americans, they conjure up images of old Western movies, red-skinned chiefs wearing massive headdresses adorned in feathers.
However, some Native Americans find these stereotypes limiting and somewhat insulting. That's why there's a renewed effort to imprint new and more diverse images of Indigenous people in the mainstream media.
This was one of the issues hotly debated at a recent meeting of Indigenous people sponsored by the United Nations. The meeting was held under the theme Celebrating Indigenous Filmmaking. I spoke with filmmaker Alex Zacarias and radio host Tiokasin Ghosthorse about this effort and some of the constraints on Indigenous media. Alex, why did you decide to make a film about the Taino identity, and what would you like the public to get from it?
My working on the Taino documentary, which is entitled The Lost Taino Tribe, it's a play on words. The title we've never been lost, but according to the history books, we have been lost for centuries. And my attempt to retell our story from our perspective needs to be told. Basically, according to history books, our history began when Christopher Columbus arrived, and obviously that wasn't so. So my attempts is to not only talk about ourselves historically, but who we are in this contemporary world, who we are today. And I think that's sort of the issue for a lot of Indigenous people in general.
Tiokasin, in your radio program, you cover Indigenous issues concerning people all over the world. What do you make of a controversy like this? What does it say about how people feel about Indigenous identity in general?
I come from a place that exactly art is not lost. I know it's a play on a word, and Alex used the word, but Indigenous is also another. If we really know the meaning, the etymology of indigenous, you can go back into the Latin word of indigenous. It basically means the poor people over there. So when I think that in mind, we are still out of the scope of of the world view, especially here in America. But again, coming from where I come from, as a Native person, I do not want to be identified by a foreign country and their ideas of who we are still not. And I think that Alex has sort of alluded to where that we should be identifying ourselves as most people around the world are, rather than allowing others to identify who we are, because then we just become their what they can do with us. What are we? We're Indian, we're American Indian, we're Native American. They give us all kinds of names and labels, and yet, as Alex would say, he's Taino and I am Lakota, and with that is accepting who we are, because when you go between the nations, we are asking, who is your family, who are you? And rather than, having a card, or rather than having a blood quantum, how much you are, how much you're not. Those are all divisive ways of thinking about identity. And so it's really who you are as within a community and inclusion of the community, rather than exclusiveness, a chosen one mentality that America has given to the Native people of this Western Hemisphere.
And speaking about labels and stereotypes that we still see living strong today, Alex, you've recently been to a meeting at the UN, a meeting held by the UN Forum on Indigenous Issues, where one of the ideas discussed was that of the Indigenous people taking control of their image. Tell us more about what transpired in that meeting.
It was a great opportunity to meet people from the world. Literally, there was Indigenous representatives from all over the world, and I think what was really compelling was when we had the question and answer opportunity, how much we had in common in regards to getting our word out, if you will. We're into the oral tradition as far as getting our history out, but I think we're taking it further, incorporating today's technology. We're doing the visual elements to it. So what I found from that meeting itself is that there really is an audience out there, and what I'm hoping to do is, what my big concern is our youth. The identity crisis right now is you have youth that have 1 foot in one world and 1 foot in the other world, but they don't know where they belong right now. And I think that's a major confusion. And I'm hoping that this film will help shine a light a little bit about their background, who they are, and to be proud about being Indigenous.
Tiokasin, you're one voice for the Indigenous community, and again, you bring various issues to the fore, but would more strengthen Indigenous media improve the image that the Indigenous have today?
I think the more intention we as Indigenous peoples have and know who we are, the more attention that will bring to the world. As the world knows, at the UN there's about 350 million Native people or Indigenous peoples left out of close to almost 8 billion now, other people. And what that means is that we still live on 70% of the land that is pristine and clean. And the other world or the other people want that land that we live on. So when we remember who we are and go back to the media that we must present, it's our voice, it's our vision, it's our prophecy. And because we all go back to it, we were all Indigenous peoples at one time. It's just that the majority of the world has forgotten how to be that.
Alex, what's the relationship between the Taino, those who claim Taino identity in Puerto Rico, and the local media?
Well, we have generations and generations of being bombarded, as far as the media is concerned, with the cowboys and Indians concept. I mean, that's been around forever, and it's an idea that's been ingrained and burned, and it's going to take that same type of method of re-educating our population, but from our perspective. As far as the media,
And how do you educate the population? What needs to be done?
what needs to be done is to tell the story, our history as it has always been, and to not, because basically, if you the books literally say we don't exist, but if you look at who wrote the book and how they wrote the book and for what reasons they wrote the book, you'll find that there's a lot of underlying, everything from, as our guest mentioned, stealing the lands, wiping out our, the last territories that they cannot take from us, and they're trying to do that, is our minds. I mean, they've already taken lands, but the last area that we have to defend ourselves is our minds. Meaning we not to be programmed, and that's and I think that the media has that power because most people believe what they see, especially our younger generation. They believe what they see. So if we can start showing the true self, the positive self, I think they'll incorporate that into their psyche.
Tiokasin, you have the last word.
I mean, I agree with what Alex is saying. I just like to add that because radio has been here, the most far-reaching media of all time, I think that we are forgetting the oral traditions that we as Indigenous peoples have around the world, that it's through the storytelling, through media, through radio. And I think that when you turn off all the lights that this culture or society runs by, what's left? You can generate small amounts of electricity for radio. Radio reaches as far reaches into the mountains of Colombia or South America, and those Indigenous peoples down there know what's going on because of that radio. And once in a while they get to watch video when there's enough power or something, but we're talking about a few privileged Native Americans, so to speak, and the rest of the world that are privileged to have electricity in order to do this. But when you have radio, there's something else to be said, because you have no other time in cultures that are differing. I think that radio gets to the human being aspect of hearing and feeling what it's really, what's real and what's not real.
Alex, Zacarias, and Tiokasin Ghosthorse, thank you very much for being in studio with us today.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for having me on your show.
When we come back, is Mexican border violence getting sexually provocative?
The smallest moments can have the biggest impact on a child's life. Take time to be a dad today.
And finally tonight, by now the gruesome images of violence along the US-Mexico border are no longer new to many of us.
Sometimes those same images seen in another context can raise new questions about how violence is told and sold visually.
Producer Michelle García recently traveled to Mexico City and brought back this reporter's notebook on the sexing up and selling of violence.
10 years since I last visited Mexico City, a city of cute, well-trimmed parks, a city packed with busy mercados, and on every sidewalk, an abundance of newspaper stands. What stands out are gruesome images of violence on the U.S. border and other hot spots, coupled with photos of scantily clad women. The combination almost seems violent. I test up my observation on Victor Luna, a second-generation magazine vendor.
No, de hecho no lo veo de esa manera porque, o sea, son modelos, pero en situación real, probablemente.
But in the context of the gruesome images, the women seem part of the violence.
Lo que pasa es que me imagino que al ser humano le gusta aparte saber que la otra persona es un poco sumisa ante ti. Entonces, por eso esa es la expresión que tienen que usar las modelos. Yo pienso
Is fantasy tagged on to real-life violent situations? Selling sex fantasy from a violent reality?
Tiene que ser así. Para que tú compres algo, tiene que ser algo que te gustaría hacer o algo que te gustaría vivir, pero partiendo de algo que tú algo cotidiano.
That's how you get readers, he says. Sell them a fantasy that's based on the day's news. And the day's news in Mexico is violence. Thousands killed on the border and elsewhere, the result of a complex combination of drug war and impunity. But do these images make light of suffering? Does fantasy frame a bloody reality? My questions lead me to Professor Deborah Castillo, a contributor to a new anthology on media coverage of violence on the border.
In Mexico, there is this kind of attraction towards what he calls the apetecibles cuerpos de la miseria. So, and the word apetecible, I think, is interesting because it's desirable, but it's also something delicious.
A term coined by Mexican writer José Joaquín Blanco.
And there's this whole class aspect to it where upper class people can get certain kinds of vicarious titillation from the spectacle of lower class violence.
There's an emerging consensus that such images foster widespread social indifference. And indifference has long been blamed for the hundreds of unsolved murders in the border city of Ciudad Juárez. Indifference, a former Mexican prosecutor said, is a major reason behind official complicity. As a result, Castillo says, grieving families must puncture indifference and class divide with their own visual story about women.
They talk about, my daughter, she's a student, she goes to school, she works hard, she's a catechist for the church, she's helping raise her brother and sister. All of these kinds of this kind of language is saying this is a person who's worthy. This is a person who deserves to live.
On the day I said goodbye to Mexico City, the story in every paper was of yet another image. Two mothers from the border city of Ciudad Juárez who had traveled to Mexico City to denounce government inaction. One daughter was disappeared, the other beaten to death by her partner. These images were of women confronting impunity because the boyfriend, although found guilty, remained at large. For Independent Sources, I'm Michelle García.
That's our show. Thanks for watching, and we hope you join us again next week.
Till then, be independent-minded.